The town of Dry Creek bustled in the mid-morning sun, its single, dusty street alive with clatter and chatter. Wagons rattled over ruts, merchants called from their storefronts, and a pair of cowhands lounged outside the saloon, hats tipped low. But none of it registered to Ethan Cole. His entire world was fixed on the depot at the far end of the street, where the stagecoach was due any minute. He had shaved that morning, scraped so close the skin on his jaw still stung. His best coat, though still plain and patched at one elbow, hung over his broad shoulders. His boots were polished as well as the dust would allow. And yet, even with all his efforts, he felt like a fraud. This was it. The woman from the letters, Clara Davenport, would be stepping off that coach. He pictured her 100 ways, each time modest, plain, ordinary. Someone who might not turn heads, but who might fill the silence of his lonely ranch house. Someone like him. The depot crowd grew as word spread. Folks were curious. They always were when a rancher sent for a bride. Some whispered, others chuckled, and Ethan felt their eyes pressing into his back. He ignored them, shifting his weight, clenching and unclenching his fist. Then came the sound, the crack of the whip, the jangle of harnesses, the thunder of hooves on hard-packed dirt. Dust billowed at the end of the street as the stagecoach came barreling in, slowing only as it reached the depot, horses snorting and stamping. The driver called out, "Dry Creek Depot," and pulled the team to a halt. The door swung open. A woman descended first, dressed in a traveling gown the color of a summer sky. She wore a simple bonnet, but when she lifted her chin, Ethan's breath stopped in his throat. She was beautiful. Not the kind of beauty whispered about in saloons or praised in churchyards, but a breathtaking, almost unreal kind. Her dark hair framed a face delicate and radiant, her eyes luminous with both strength and something softer, something searching. Even the dust of the journey couldn't dim her presence. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought she must be lost. Surely a lady like that hadn't come for him. Surely she belonged to another passenger, perhaps some visiting dignitary or merchant. But then she looked directly at him and smiled. The world narrowed to that single moment. He felt his heart slam against his ribs, his throat go dry. All at once he knew he had been wrong in every assumption. This was Clara Davenport. This woman, this vision had answered his humble letter. And she was walking toward him, the depot murmured alive with whispers. Good Lord, she's a fine one, too fine for the likes of him. Ain't no way she stay out there on that dusty ranch. Ethan heard it all, each word driving a deeper nail into his doubts. He dropped his gaze, fumbling to remove his hat. When Clara reached him, he forced himself to speak, though the words scraped his throat. Miss Davenport? Yes. Her voice was clear, calm, carrying a trace of refinement. But there was warmth, too. She extended her gloved hand. And you must be Mr. Cole. He hesitated before taking her hand, rough palm against delicate fingers. He wanted to apologize for the dirt under his nails, for the sweat that clung to his skin despite the morning wash, for every flaw that made him unworthy of such a woman. Instead, all he managed was, "Ma'am." Clara's eyes softened. For a moment, it seemed she could read his unease, could sense the storm within him. She tilted her head slightly and said almost teasingly, "You expected someone else?" The truth struck too close, and Ethan found himself stammering. I didn't reckon." He stopped at a loss. She only smiled again, as if his awkwardness did not trouble her in the least. "Well," she said, adjusting her bonnet, "I am here. If you will have me." The depot went silent at those words. A woman so radiant, so elegant, standing beside the loner rancher and claiming him as hers. Ethan felt the eyes of the entire town on him, their disbelief heavy as iron, but all he could think was this: she was too beautiful, too fine, too much. And he had no idea why fate had sent her to him. The wagon ride back to the ranch should have been simple, a man bringing home his promised bride. But for Ethan Cole, every rattle of the wheels over the dry earth seemed to pound his doubts deeper into his bones. Clara Davenport sat beside him on the bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The blue of her traveling dress glowed against the dusty backdrop, and her bonnet framed a face so striking Ethan barely dared glance at her. Each time he did, it only reminded him how out of place she seemed, how out of place he was beside her, He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. His calloused hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary, knuckles white. "You're very quiet, Mr. Cole," Clara said at last. Her voice light but edged with curiosity. He cleared his throat. "Don't talk much, so I've gathered," she replied with a faint smile. "Your letters were plain but steady." "I like that." Her words pricked at him like a thorn. She liked them? She must have seen through his bluntness, seen how little polish he had to offer. Yet she had chosen to come. The thought stirred both hope and dread after a long silence. Ethan muttered, "Suppose you expected someone different." Clara turned her gaze on him, eyes bright beneath her bonnet's shade. "I expected a man who meant the words he wrote. And here you are." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his doubts gnawing harder. "If only you knew what kind of man I truly am," he thought, rough, quiet, hard, a loner with nothing to offer a woman like her. But dirt under her fingernails and endless silence, the land stretched before them, dry hills rolling into open sky. When the ranch finally came into view, a simple cabin, a leaning barn, fences in need of mending, Ethan's shame grew heavier. He glanced at Clara, bracing for the flicker of disappointment he was sure would come, but Clara only leaned forward, her eyes widening with interest. "So this is your home," she said softly. "Such as it is," Ethan muttered. "It looks strong," she said. "And honest. A place where one could begin again." Her words puzzled him. No judgment, no ridicule, just acceptance. Yet that only made him more uneasy. That evening, as Clara unpacked in the cabin, Ethan busied himself with chores outside. He stacked firewood, though it didn't need stacking, fixed a gate hinge that had never bothered him before, anything to avoid being near her too long. The longer he looked at her, the more he felt the cruel mismatch of it all. By supper, Clara had prepared a simple meal, nothing fancy, just beans and bread, but she served it with a grace that made the humble table seem finer than it ever had. She smiled across the table, speaking of her journey, of the stars she had watched from the coach windows. Ethan listened, answering with short nods or quiet words, his heart twisting tighter. When she excused herself for rest, Ethan remained at the table, staring into the dying fire. His chest ached with the weight of his thoughts. He had asked for a common bride, plain and steady, someone who might endure the life he had carved out of this harsh land. Instead, he had been given a woman so radiant she made the whole room brighter, a woman who could have been courted by gentlemen in silk waistcoats and fine houses, and here she was on his ranch, in his cabin, sleeping under his roof. Ethan pressed his palms against the table, his jaw tight. It was only a matter of time, he told himself. A woman like Clara Davenport would realize she'd made a mistake. When she did, she'd leave and he'd be alone again, worse than before, because he'd have tasted what he could never truly have. And in that moment, Ethan Cole made a silent vow he would not let himself hope. Hope, after all, was more dangerous than loneliness. Morning on the Cole ranch broke quietly, with the soft hum of wind through the mesquite and the faint creak of the windmill turning against the pale sky. Ethan was already outside before dawn, feeding the horses and checking the fences, hoping to escape the gnawing thoughts that had plagued him all night. But when he returned to the cabin, the smell of fresh biscuits met him at the door. Clara was already awake, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, humming softly as she worked at the stove. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she greeted without turning. Ethan stopped in the doorway, stunned by the sight. The morning light filtered through the window, catching on her hair where it had slipped from its pins. She looked settled, as if she already belonged here. "You didn't have to," he began. "I did," she interrupted gently, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. "A home needs tending, and I like to keep busy. Besides, I wanted to do something for you." Ethan felt heat creep up his neck. He shifted his boots against the floorboards, unsure what to do with his hands. "Don't expect much out here," he muttered. "Ain't a fine life." Clara placed a plate of biscuits on the table and met his eyes squarely. "I didn't come here for fine things, Mr. Cole. I came for a life I could build with someone who keeps his word." "Your letter spoke of honesty and hard work." "That's what I wanted." Her voice was steady, her smile unwavering, and Ethan found himself caught off guard. Most folks who looked at him saw only his rough edges, his silence, his lack of polish. Yet Clara looked at him as if she saw something different, something worth staying for. He cleared his throat, sat down heavily at the table, and reached for a biscuit. But as he ate, he couldn't shake the thought. She doesn't understand what she's chosen. After breakfast, Clara insisted on helping with the day's work. Ethan tried to steer her toward the lighter chores, but she rolled up her sleeves and followed him out to the corral. When he began mending a broken section of fence, she gathered the tools and held the posts steady without complaint. Dust clung to her dress. The sun flushed her cheeks. But still she smiled. "You don't have to prove anything," Ethan told her at last, watching as she wiped sweat from her brow. "I'm not proving anything," Clara replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm showing you I belong here. That I chose this life." The words hit him harder than he expected. Belong. Chose. They weren't words a woman like her should be saying about a man like him. Yet she said them with such certainty that for a fleeting moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe them. By evening, the two of them stood together, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Clara's smile, faint but steady, softened the day's hard edges. "You still look at me as if I don't fit," she said quietly. Not accusing, just observing. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't. You're too much for this place." "Too much for me." Clara tilted her head, her eyes searching his. Then she reached out, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Cole, you may see a lonely rancher, but I see a man strong enough to carry more than his share of burdens. I see the truth in you, and that's worth more than polished words or fine houses." Ethan stared at her, struggling to breathe past the knot in his chest. Her smile lingered, calm and unyielding. A determined smile, the kind that promised she was here not by accident or mistake, but by choice. And for the first time since she had stepped off that wagon, Ethan felt his carefully guarded walls begin to crack. The following afternoon, the prairie sky began to shift. What had been a wide expanse of brilliant blue slowly thickened with gray clouds rolling in from the west. Ethan noticed the change while repairing a gate near the barn. Years of ranching had taught him to read the sky like scripture, and the signs weren't promising. "Storm's coming," he muttered under his breath. Tightening the last bolt with rough hands, Clara appeared at the barn door, a basket of laundry in her arms. She followed his gaze upward, her brows knitting as the first low rumble of thunder trembled across the distance. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. "Could be," Ethan answered. "Wind'll tear through here, maybe worse. We'd best tie everything down." Without hesitation, Clara set aside the basket and joined him. While Ethan secured the horses and reinforced the barn doors, Clara gathered the laundry, covered the chicken coop, and carried smaller tools inside. Her dress whipped in the growing wind, hair tumbling loose from its pins, yet she moved quickly. Without complaint, the storm broke at sundown. A violent wind roared across the plains, bending mesquite trees and howling through every crack in the cabin walls. Rain came in sheets, hammering against the roof until it seemed the boards would split. Lightning split the sky in jagged streaks, followed almost instantly by earth-shaking thunder. Inside, Ethan checked the shutters and placed buckets where the roof leaked. Clara moved beside him, steady, calm despite the chaos raging outside. "I've weathered storms before," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the roar. "But never quite like this." Ethan glanced at her, half surprised at her composure. "Most folks are frightened first time out here." She met his eyes and smiled faintly. "I am frightened, but fear doesn't mean I run." The words struck him deeper than he cared to admit. For years, Ethan had lived with people leaving neighbors, workers, even family. But here was a woman who had stepped straight into a tempest and still spoke of staying. When lightning cracked so close the cabin shook, Clara startled, gripping the edge of the table. Ethan's instincts overrode hesitation. He reached for her hand, steadying her. Their eyes locked, the air between them charged with something almost as powerful as the storm itself. "I won't let anything happen to you," Ethan said, the promise rough but sincere. Clara's fingers tightened around his. "And I won't let you carry it all alone." For a long moment, the storm outside faded in his mind. All Ethan could see was her, the determination in her gaze, the warmth of her touch. It unnerved him as much as it soothed him. The storm raged through most of the night, tearing shingles from the roof and flattening a portion of the fence. When at last the thunder grew distant and the rain softened to a steady drizzle, Ethan opened the door to assess the damage. The ranch looked battered but standing. He silently thanked Providence it hadn't been worse. Clara joined him at the threshold, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The dawn light broke slowly through the thinning clouds, painting the wet earth in silvery hues. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan stared at her, surprised again. Where he saw broken boards and endless work ahead, she saw beauty. Her resilience humbled him in ways he hadn't expected. He realized then that she wasn't fragile porcelain as he had feared. Clara had strength different from his, but just as vital. The storm had tested them both. It had shaken the walls of the ranch, but in its wake, something stronger had taken root between them, and Ethan knew, with a mix of fear and wonder, that his solitary world might never be the same again. The wind whistled across the dry plains, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and cattle. Ethan Cole stood by the corral fence, his weathered hands resting on the rough wood as he watched the herd graze lazily under the noonday sun. His hat shaded his eyes, but it couldn't hide the deep lines etched into his face, a map of years spent under the unrelenting western sky. Ethan was a man of silence and solitude. At 35, he had lived more years alone than with company. His parents had died when he was young, and his only brother had fallen during a border skirmish years ago. Since then, Ethan had poured his strength into the land. He built his ranch plank by plank, mended the fences, raised cattle, and kept to himself. People in town called him the loner rancher. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, but his quiet nature and scarred past made him seem distant. He didn't drink much at the saloon, rarely lingered after buying supplies, and never took part in gossip. When women passed him by, their eyes curious, he tipped his hat politely but said little more. And though many whispered that he was a strong man who could make a fine husband, Ethan never sought one out. Truth was, he didn't think himself worthy. What did he have to offer beyond a rough cabin, a few hundred head of cattle, and a heart too battered to dream of romance? But loneliness had its own sharp teeth. Nights on the ranch were long. The fire crackled, coyotes howled, and Ethan sometimes sat at his table staring at the empty chair across from him. He told himself he didn't need anyone, but the silence always proved him a liar. It was that silence that finally drove him to write the letter. One evening, after a long day branding calves, he lit the lantern, dipped a pen into ink, and scratched out words in his blunt, unpolished hand. "My name is Ethan Cole. I am a rancher in the New Mexico Territory. My life is plain but steady. I can offer food, shelter, and loyalty. I seek a wife who is not afraid of hard work, who will keep house and share in the labor. I'm not a man of charm or finery, but I will treat her with respect." He hesitated before signing his name. The words looked stiff, almost cold, but they were honest. He didn't dress them up with promises he couldn't keep. He wasn't offering a fairy tale, just a life. When he sealed the letter and sent it off to an agency in St. Louis, he felt both foolish and strangely relieved. Foolish, because what kind of woman would answer such a blunt proposal? Relieved, because he had finally admitted to himself, if no one else, that he longed for companionship. Weeks passed. Then one hot morning, a reply arrived. A woman named Clara Davenport had answered. Her words were graceful, careful, written in a hand so fine that Ethan almost didn't want to smudge the page with his calloused fingers. She wrote that she admired his honesty, that she too longed for a simple, honest life away from society's noise. The more he read her letters, the more his heart stirred in ways he hadn't thought possible. But still, Ethan pictured her as plain, perhaps a farm widow, or a seamstress weary of city life. Someone practical, steady, unadorned. That was what he expected. That was what he thought he deserved. And so, as he leaned against the corral fence that morning, Ethan told himself the woman who stepped off that stagecoach in a few weeks would be no different from him, ordinary, unremarkable, just seeking a place to belong. He had no idea that fate was about to send him a woman so radiant, so breathtaking that he would doubt the ground he stood on, a woman far too beautiful, he thought, to ever be his. The first time Ethan read Clara Davenport's letter, He thought surely it had been sent to the wrong man. The page was neat, written in an elegant, flowing script, each word carrying a certain grace. She had introduced herself simply as Clara, a woman of 24 who longed for a different kind of life. She did not linger on her past, only wrote that she had once known a world of polished surfaces and false smiles, and wanted no more of it. She sought instead a place where truth meant more than appearances, where work was shared and where silence could be a comfort, not a prison. At first, Ethan read it with suspicion. He was no fool. He knew many men had been tricked by flattering letters only to find disappointment or worse deceit when the bride arrived. But Clara's words were not those of a woman chasing gold. She had not asked about the size of his ranch, nor about the cattle he owned. Instead, she had asked, "Do you rise with the sun? Do you find peace in the sound of the wind moving through grass? Do you prefer the company of books or the company of firelight?" Ethan sat at his table late that night, her letter spread before him. The lantern flickered, casting shadows over the wooden walls of his cabin. He read those questions again and again until they seemed to echo inside his chest. What kind of woman asked a man such things? He took up his pen, though his fingers felt clumsy compared to the fine strokes of her hand. "I do rise with the sun," he wrote, "and most nights I am asleep not long after it sets. I do find peace in the sound of the wind. The prairie sings its own kind of song if you listen long enough. As for company, sometimes a book, but most often the fire. It's easier to sit across from silence than from words you don't trust." He paused, frowning at his bluntness, but left it as it was. He didn't know how to polish thoughts like hers, but he could at least speak plain. Clara's next letter came 2 weeks later, and when Ethan saw the postman ride out with it, he felt a strange quickening in his chest. This time she answered him warmly, even teasing him for his grim tone. "Firelight is a faithful friend, yes," she wrote, "but I hope you won't find me such a poor replacement." That line alone kept him awake. Long into the night. So the letters continued. She told him she loved music, but rarely had the chance to play anymore. She had grown tired of the shallow manners of city gentlemen who praised her looks but never listened to her mind. She yearned for a life that meant something, where her hands might find honest work. Ethan, in turn, shared more than he had in years. He wrote of his land, the dry creeks in summer, the golden fields after rain, the smell of horses and leather and wood smoke. He confessed he was not a gentleman, nor one quick with words, but he could be steady, loyal, and true. Sometimes, after he sealed his letters, doubt gnawed at him. What if she thought him too dull? Too rough? Wouldn't any woman grow weary of silence, of dirt under fingernails and sweat on shirts? But Clara's replies never faltered. If anything, they seemed to reach deeper each time. Finally, one morning, he received the words that would change everything. "Ethan, I will come. If you still wish me, I will board the stagecoach and meet you by month's end. Please look for me. I will be wearing a blue traveling dress, and I will be ready to begin our life." Ethan read that line 3 times, his hand trembling. She was coming. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, where it stayed close to his chest every day after. Yet for all her grace, her fine words, and the strange way she had already unsettled his heart, Ethan imagined her as plain. Maybe tired from years of disappointment, perhaps a widow, maybe even scarred in some way. He didn't care. He wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for truth, and that, he told himself, was all Clara Davenport promised. He didn't yet know that when the stagecoach arrived, and Clara stepped down in her blue traveling dress, the sight of her would strike him like a thunderbolt, too beautiful, too radiant for any man like him to claim. The storm left the land scarred but cleansed. For 2 days, Ethan worked from dawn until long after dusk, repairing the broken fence line, clearing fallen branches, and patching the roof. He thought Clara would stay indoors, but she was there beside him, each step hauling wood, holding tools, carrying water. She stumbled once in the mud, laughter ringing bright as she nearly lost her balance, and Ethan caught her by the arm. Their eyes met briefly, and for a heartbeat too long. Neither moved. "You don't have to do this," he said, voice low. "I know," she replied softly, brushing hair from her damp face. "But I want to." That quiet admission echoed in him long after she let go of his arm. By the third evening, the worst of the work was finished. The ranch stood steady again, though Ethan knew there would always be more chores tomorrow. Still, he felt a rare, quiet satisfaction as he watched the sun drop behind the hills. The air smelled of rain-washed earth and mesquite, and the silence seemed almost holy. Clara stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin mugs of coffee. She handed one to Ethan and settled into the chair beside him. The dusk wrapped around them like a blanket, and for a while, they sat without speaking. Ethan stole a glance at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The fading light softened her features, making her look almost otherworldly. He wondered, not for the first time, how such a woman had ended up on his lonely doorstep. Clara broke the silence. "I've never seen skies so wide. At the convent, the walls were high. I thought the world was small. But out here," she gestured toward the horizon, "it feels endless." He turned his gaze outward, grateful for the distraction. "Endless can be lonely," she studied him, her expression gentle. "But it doesn't have to be. Not if someone shares it with you." The words struck deep, and Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't a man accustomed to being seen, much less understood. Yet Clara's words carried no judgment, only quiet truth. He set his mug down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Clara, you ought to know I'm not the kind of man you deserve. You deserve fine things, an easy life. Not hard days and empty miles." Clara tilted her head, considering him. Then she smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to undo him more than any storm. "Do you think I can't see who you are, Ethan? I chose this. I chose you." His chest tightened at her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to reach out and take her hand, to let himself hope. But fear still held him back. Fear that if he reached too far, she would slip away like every other good thing in his life. The moment stretched between them, filled with all the words neither dared to say. A soft breeze stirred Clara's hair, and before he realized what he was doing, Ethan reached out and tucked a loose strand behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin, warm and smooth, and the contact jolted him like lightning. Clara's eyes widened, then softened. She didn't pull away. Ethan's breath caught. He withdrew his hand slowly, forcing himself to lean back in his chair. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It thrummed with unspoken things, with the quiet beginnings of something neither of them could deny. As the stars emerged one by one across the endless sky, Clara's voice drifted softly. "It doesn't feel lonely tonight." Ethan swallowed hard, staring into the dark horizon. He didn't trust himself to answer, but inside, the truth pressed against his ribs. "Neither does it for me." And though neither spoke of it again that night, both felt the whisper of something growing, something fragile, something dangerous, something they could no longer ignore. The days that followed carried a rhythm that felt almost natural. Ethan working the ranch, Clara finding ways to bring life into the lonely cabin. She sewed curtains for the windows, baked bread that filled the rooms with warmth, and even planted flowers along the porch despite the dry earth. Each touch reminded Ethan of something he hadn't realized he'd lost, the sense of home. Still, beneath the rhythm, tension lingered. Ethan could feel it in every glance that lingered too long, every brush of hands when tools were passed, every silence stretched between them. Clara felt it too. She carried herself with quiet patience, waiting for words he was too guarded to say. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, Clara carried a bucket of water from the well. Ethan watched from the corral, noticing how her dress caught the last rays of light. He tried to focus on tightening the saddle strap, but his hands faltered. "Let me take that," he said, striding forward. He relieved her of the bucket, their fingers brushing, and a spark jolted through him. "Thank you," Clara replied. Breathless, though the load was gone, they walked back toward the cabin together, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. When they reached the porch, Ethan set the bucket down and straightened. Clara lingered beside him, her eyes searching his face. "You've been kind," she said softly. "Kinder than you think. But you keep your heart locked away, Ethan. Why?" He froze, every muscle stiffening. Because hearts get broken when you let 'em out, he muttered. Clara stepped closer, close enough that he caught the faint scent of lavender clinging to her hair. Mine's been broken before, she whispered. But I'd rather live with an open heart than hide behind walls forever. Her words disarmed him completely. He turned to look at her, and the sight of her eyes shimmering with honesty, lips parted in the fading light, was almost too much. He wanted to tell her everything, but years of silence pressed against him like chains. Instead, he reached for her hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, tentative at first, as though expecting her to pull away. But Clara held on, firm and sure. I don't know how to be what you need, Ethan confessed. Voice rough. Clara smiled, a soft, luminous thing. You already are. Something in him gave way then, like a dam breaking under the weight of a flood. He cupped her cheek with his free hand, his thumb brushing the soft curve of her face. Clara leaned into the touch, her eyes closing as if she had been waiting for this moment all along when he bent his head. The kiss was hesitant, at first awkward, searching. But as her arms slid around his shoulders and she pressed closer, it deepened, carrying the unspoken promises neither had dared to voice, the world around them, the creak of the porch, the whisper of the wind. The distant lowing of cattle faded until there was only this, her warmth, her certainty, the way she fit against him like she had always been meant to. When at last they pulled apart, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I've lived alone a long time, he murmured. Didn't think I had room for anyone, but you. Clara, you've changed everything. Her answering smile was radiant. And I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. The stars emerged overhead, silent witnesses to a bond sealed not by letters or promises, but by the courage to finally speak their hearts. Ethan held her close. No longer a loner, no longer just a rancher with empty miles stretching before him. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The kiss on the porch had changed everything, though neither Ethan nor Clara said so aloud. From that night forward, the air between them carried a quiet tenderness, a certainty that no storm could erase. Still, words of love were fragile things, and Ethan, a man unaccustomed to speaking from the heart, stumbled when trying to name what he felt. Instead, he showed it in the only ways he knew how, by working harder, by leaving small acts of care in his wake, by ensuring Clara never lacked for anything. When autumn rolled across the prairie, bringing cooler wines and fields of golden grass, Ethan drove Clara into town. They had business at the church, a small gathering where vows would be spoken. He hadn't intended on rushing marriage, but Clara had made it plain in her gentle, steady way. We've chosen each other. Ethan, it's time the world knows it. The townsfolk turned their heads when she entered the chapel, not in ridicule as Ethan had once feared, but in quiet awe. Clara's beauty, unadorned save for a simple blue dress, drew every eye. Yet her gaze was fixed only on Ethan, who stood waiting at the front, stiff in his cleanest shirt and freshly polished boots. The preacher's words were simple, spoken over clasped hands and solemn promises. Ethan had thought his tongue might falter, but when it came time to speak, the words came steady. I take you, Clara, as my wife, she smiled, and the strength of it steadied him more than any oath ever had. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, the townsfolk clapped politely, some smiling, others whispering about how a man so solitary had found a bride so radiant. Ethan ignored them all. The only thing that mattered was the woman beside him, his wife. Their first weeks as husband and wife were not without trial. Married life brought small adjustments and at times sharp edges. Clara insisted on rearranging the cabin, softening its harsh lines with color and fabric. Ethan grumbled, unused to change. Yet when he saw the way the light fell through her new curtains or how the hearth glowed warmer with her touch, he found himself grateful in silence. There were harder moments, too. Ethan, stubborn in his independence, sometimes pulled away when she asked too much of his heart. Clara, in turn, learned to wait with patience, offering kindness without demand. Slowly, Ethan realized that love was not a sudden blaze but a steady fire that required tending. And Clara, with her quiet strength, was tending it every day. One evening, as winter's chill set in, Ethan returned from repairing a distant water trough to find Clara curled by the fire, mending one of his shirts. She looked up and smiled, and something inside him broke open. Setting his tools aside, he knelt before her, taking her hands. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed," he admitted, voice thick. "And I love you, Clara. I should have said it sooner." Her eyes glistened, and she squeezed his hands. "I knew, Ethan, but hearing it makes my heart full." That night, in the quiet of the cabin, they spoke freely of hopes and fears, of children yet to come, of dreams they'd once buried but now might share. For the first time, Ethan felt the future not as a lonely stretch of land, but as a path walked together. The union they had forged was no fairy tale. It was tested daily by the harshness of the land, by Ethan's guarded nature, by the weight of work that never ceased. But each challenge only strengthened what they had begun. Their marriage was not built on chance or outward appearances, but on choice, on resilience, on the stubborn, beautiful truth that love had found them in the unlikeliest of places. And as the snow began to dust the prairie, Ethan Cole, once the loner rancher, now found himself with a partner at his side, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Winter deepened across the plains, a quiet season of snow-dusted grasslands and frosted windows. For Ethan Cole, it was always the hardest time of year, nights long and cold, days filled with endless chores that seemed to multiply as the land froze. But this year was different. This year, Clara was there. The cabin that once echoed with silence now held laughter and warmth. Clara sang softly while preparing meals, her voice blending with the crackle of the fire. She filled the table with simple but hearty food, each dish a reminder that Ethan no longer ate alone. And in the evenings, when the wind howled outside, she would sit close beside him, her hand resting on his arm, anchoring him to a life he had never thought he'd deserve. One evening, as a storm swirled outside, Ethan sat by the fire whittling a piece of cedar wood. Clara was sewing, her face serene in the lamplight. She glanced up and smiled at him, the kind of smile that made the years of solitude seem like a distant shadow. "You look at peace," she said. He shrugged, not trusting himself to say much. Yet, in his chest, he knew it was true. For years he had thought peace unattainable, something meant for other men, not for one burdened by losses and regrets. But Clara's presence had changed him in quiet ways. She had taught him that peace wasn't about the absence of hardship, but the presence of love. The following spring brought renewal. The land, softened by melting snow, bloomed with wildflowers. Clara planted a garden beside the cabin, her hands in the soil, her laughter ringing whenever Ethan teased her about city hands that had somehow turned stubborn and strong. She thrived in the rhythm of ranch life, and Ethan found himself marveling at her resilience. Her joy in the simplest tasks. Neighbors began to visit more often, curious about the once solitary rancher who now had a wife radiant with life. Some came offering friendship, others out of gossip, but all left remarking on how Ethan Cole seemed changed. Where once his words were few and his gaze hard, now he carried himself with a quiet pride. His wife always near, his home no longer empty. In late summer, Clara shared the news that shifted everything once more. She was expecting. Ethan stood stunned at first, staring at her as though he'd misheard. But when he saw the hope in her eyes, something inside him cracked wide open. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as if he could shield both her and the child from the world's hardships. "I never thought I'd have this," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Clara's hand rested over his heart. "And yet here it is. A family. Our family." The months that followed were filled with preparations. Ethan built a sturdy cradle from oak, each carved detail a testament to his newfound hope. Clara sewed tiny garments, humming as she worked, her glow brighter with each passing day. When the baby arrived, a daughter with Clara's delicate features and Ethan's clear eyes, the ranch seemed to breathe with new life. Ethan held the child in his arms, rough hands cradling her with reverence, tears slipping unbidden down his weathered cheeks. "She's perfect," Clara whispered. Resting against him, Ethan could only nod, his throat too tight for words. In that moment, he knew with unshakable certainty that he was no longer the loner rancher who had once expected a plain bride to fill the silence of his life. He was a husband, a father, a man made whole by love he had never dared to imagine. Years would pass, seasons would turn, and hardships would come. But Ethan Cole would face them differently now, not alone, but with Clara by his side and their daughter in his arms. The cabin on the prairie, once a fortress against loneliness, had become a home alive with laughter, love, and the promise of tomorrow. The loner was no more. He had been found, remade, and redeemed by a woman who was far more than he ever believed he deserved, and by a love that proved itself truer than the wide, endless sky.